honor to have this distinguished guest for the last roundtable of the first Aerospace Forum in Africa. Together with us, you have, cher Max, introduced the people, but Madame Ilan Katsini, you are the Chief Commercial Officer at Royal Air Maroc, and we'll be speaking in French with you today. I'm French, so that's fine to me. Rob Gurney, you are the CEO of the One World Alliance, that is very much famous. Mr. Tassou, the CEO of Ethiopian Airlines, and Mr. Aaron Munetsi, the CEO of the Airlines Association in Southern Africa. That would be very interesting to have you, all of us, your view as well. We will be spending 40 minutes together, and if you allow me, I would like to really go step by step, maybe asking three main questions. The first one would be how basically you cope with the last 2 years facing a COVID crisis, and how did you recover from it? Talk a bit about the development, in your view, of air traffic in Africa, and finish up with the main challenges that we are all facing: digitalization, talent acquisition, and of course, decarbonization of aviation. Mais peut-être que je peux commencer avec vous, Madame Cassini de la Royal Air Maroc. Alors, je ne sais pas, vous êtes pilote, c'est ça? Parce que j'ai vu votre tête quand Max Harmonet disait que vous étiez pilote. L'une n'est parfaite. Mais vous avez encore un peu de temps pour peut-être apprendre. Okay. Madame Cassini, d'abord merci de nous accueillir aussi ici. Une question peut-être rapide. J'ai eu l'occasion comme ministre d'avoir des dialogues nourris avec mon ex-homologue marocain pendant la période du Covid, avec des arrêts réciproques et le plus coordonnés possible. Mais peut-être ma première question est une question de bilan. Quelques mois après la phase la plus aiguë du Covid, comment avez-vous passé ces 2 années et comment le trafic aérien, dans le contexte de la Royal Air Maroc, a pu reprendre, et de quelle façon avez-vous vécu cette séquence?
Très bien. Merci. Bonjour tout le monde. Tout d'abord, je voudrais remercier les organisateurs, JIMAS, pour l'organisation de cet événement très important, à la fois pour notre continent et notre industrie, et aussi d'avoir choisi Casablanca comme lieu pour cette rencontre. Casablanca qui est le hub de la compagnie nationale Royal Air Maroc. Alors, pour parler du Covid, j'aurais préféré parler développement pour oublier les années du Covid, mais bon, je pense que c'est un passage obligé. Donc effectivement, la crise du Covid était la pire crise de l'histoire du transport aérien. Une crise inédite qui a mis à mal toutes les capacités du transport aérien, qui a cloué les avions au sol. Bon, maintenant, dans toute crise, il y a des opportunités. Donc, pour nous, au Royal Air Maroc, cette crise nous a permis de faire un bilan, de revoir un certain nombre de process internes pour plus de compétitivité, pour plus d'agilité et pour plus de résilience. En tout cas, cette crise a montré une fois encore que la compagnie est très résiliente et qu'elle sait profiter de ces crises pour rebondir encore plus forte. Donc, pendant cette crise, nous avons aussi revu tous les produits et services, et les clients qui voyagent à bord de nos avions ont certainement remarqué le renouveau en termes de produits, d'harmonie cabine, des uniformes. Donc, on a revu tout le parcours client. C'était aussi l'occasion de revoir le network, de repositionner les avions. Et aujourd'hui, je peux dire que la reprise, elle est là, elle est au rendez-vous. Le train de la reprise nous a surpris, puisqu'aujourd'hui, nous sommes quand même sur un train très positif, et qui permet aujourd'hui de dire qu'on n'est pas très loin des niveaux de trafic de 2019.
Merci beaucoup. Maybe Rob, at a global level, what are the lessons learned from the COVID crisis, and did people change the way they travel now? We talk a bit about home working and stuff, and we made the assumption very early in the crisis that people will change their way to travel in a very sustainable way. Did that happen, or is that back to normal now?
Well, I would say it was back to where it was pre-COVID. I might just sort of back up a little bit and just talk about a couple of things that we did during the pandemic as an alliance, because, clearly this was a crisis for the industry that we hadn't encountered before. And we have a risk register at One World, which covers pretty much every event you could imagine. A pandemic was on that risk register, but of course the impact that it had with us. I think that some of the things I do hope remain with us that occurred during the pandemic. One of those is collaboration. I think that's been an important theme of what we heard earlier today. We found friends in unlikely places during the alliance. I collaborated very closely with my counterparts running the Star Alliance and the SkyTeam Alliance, because we're all working to a common purpose in terms of how we actually get the right messaging out to our stakeholders, that we're consistent as an industry. We had a monthly stand-up with IATA, the 3 alliance heads, to talk about policy alignment, messaging alignment. But also within the alliance itself, we put a huge amount of effort and focus on solving for the immediate problems that we needed to solve for. And that was how we're going to cope as travel returns at scale with the increased burden on airlines to validate health credentials. And there was work and infrastructure that we created in warp speed time that I was quite amazed just how quickly we were able to do things with a cohort of airlines when there was a single-minded purpose. And if you could take that kind of energy and commitment and desire and apply it to things that are not a burning platform, I think it just demonstrates what can be done. You know, what are the kind of, longer-term kind of structural changes? I think it's hard to say. I mean, we've seen over the last summer, I think certainly in this part of the world, it's extended into the winter, a demand, well, let's hope it's not a bubble, but we've seen, an exponential growth in demand. Obviously, there was a lot of pent-up demand, a lot of it driven by leisure. Not all of the global capacity has been reinstated, so unit revenues for most airlines have been very high in the US. Some of the carriers have reported record revenue months in their history on lower capacity levels. So it gives you a sense of just how strong the top line has been. If we're looking at global business travel at the large corporations, that doesn't seem to have recovered to the extent back to 2019 levels. It's probably tracking somewhere around about 80% of those levels. Very different in the verticals. You look at consulting services, for example, and we'll get onto sustainability later, but you look at consulting companies, their travel generally down as a vertical. You look at mining and resource sector, it's massively up. I won't talk through all the verticals, we don't have time. So we have seen some changes in that. I think the need for fast, reliable information, if it wasn't there before the pandemic, it was amplified massively. So I think in the interest of time, I've spoken probably 2 or 3 minutes longer than I should have done. I'll stop there. I could probably talk about this topic alone for the whole session.
We don't. Thank you. Mr. Tassou, you run a very successful airline. Again, maybe the same question. And you serve in a very key geographical area, so to say. You have the most developed network in Africa, but you are in between many continents and places. How did you live these 2 years of the COVID crisis? Did you recover? Is the business travelers back? Are the business travelers back in your planes? I mean, where are you now?
Okay, thank you. Ethiopian Airlines didn't stop flying even when COVID-19 emerged as a global pandemic. In March 2020, when COVID was declared to be a pandemic, we immediately identified 2 opportunities in the industry. One was repatriation of people to their home countries. And secondly was cargo, transportation of medical equipment. Initially, the personal protective equipment transport from China to the rest of the world. So we quickly redeployed our resources to exploit these 2 opportunities, and we were able to generate enough revenue to keep going, even though most of our passenger aircraft remained on ground. After 5 months, countries started opening up their borders very gradually, starting in August and September of that year, and we gradually started recovering the passenger operation wherever countries opened their borders. Through this process, we were able to generate enough revenue to support our operation, to pay our debts. And Ethiopian is one of the few airlines that successfully navigated through the COVID difficult period without reducing fleet, without laying off employees, without making any substantial downsizing. We were able to move quickly to exploit the opportunities, and this has helped us to remain a profitable airline even through the 2 years period. Now, the passenger operation is recovering, and by June of this year, during which the current fiscal year will be completed, we have planned to fully recover in terms of passenger operation. Probably the number of passengers that we carry during the year by June will exceed the pre-COVID level. That is where we are now. And in fact, China remained closed during the whole 2022. Otherwise, we would have recovered earlier. The cargo operation helped us a lot.
Yeah, sure. Mr. Munetsi, from we're going down south, flying south now again. So you are the CEO of the Airlines Association for the Southern Africa. In your view, how was how the traffic picked up out of the COVID crisis, and what are the main stakes now in your opinion?
Right. So I think first and foremost, we have to acknowledge that COVID came probably as a blessing. It came as a blessing because there's a saying, one of my favorite sayings actually, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. So we got this crisis, and we actually wanted to say, while we are going through the pains of dealing with the pandemic, what actually can we do better? So as an organization, we started looking for solutions within ourselves to say, number one, what do our airline members need to stop doing? Number two, what do our regulators need to stop doing, and what else can they do to help us? And number three, what do we need to actually understand from an organizational point of view, so that we were very bold and brave to say that when this pandemic ends, what do we need to do? And that goes to your question today, to say, so what are we doing now that the pandemic is over? We are doing maybe 3 or 4 things. The first one is to say, we came up with what we call the high impact, high focus strategy. So we focused on what are the things that have got a high impact on our businesses. Things like, for example, costs. What do we do to retain, to reduce costs? So that's a high impact area for us. The cost of fuel, for example, supply of fuel, security of supply of fuel is important for us as airlines. So that's a high impact area. The second one was to say, the employees that we have, how well trained are they for the new world that they're going to be working in? Because we are no longer working in the same world that we were working in before the pandemic. So we needed to regroup immediately in terms of how we train these staff members. The third one, obviously, was to say, how do we work with the communities that are going to be our customers anyway? They've been decimated by the pandemic, but it doesn't mean that everybody's dead. Those that are still alive, how do we encourage them to start flying, or to even fly more than what they used to do before? So there were various permutations that came from all kinds of analysis, World Economic Forum, IMF. Initially, we were told it was going to be a U shape, then it was a sharp V shape, then it was a W shape, and all kinds of things. But we said to ourselves, we know exactly what we are looking at. We are looking at customers that will need to travel, and when they need to travel, how are they going to travel? Safely, in terms of their health, and also in terms of our operations. So where we are right now, the numbers are looking good, especially for us in South Africa. The domestic market is very, very resilient. We have seen the numbers really go very high, almost 87%. And also from a regional point of view, we are seeing the numbers go. But from an Africa continent point of view, the numbers are not going as fast as they should be. And I will address that later.
Madame Casini, notre collègue Mounetsi citait Churchill qui disait qu'il ne faut jamais gâcher une bonne crise. La crise a eu lieu. Vous parliez de ce que vous avez fait au niveau des produits, notamment pour repenser un peu tous les produits. Comment aujourd'hui la Royal Air Maroc se projette dans ce développement du transport aérien régional? Quelle part veut-elle y prendre et comment envisagez-vous l'avenir plus largement?
Maybe it will be better that I switch in English
That's
for
fine.
my colleague. Yes. So maybe perhaps I have to speak about Africa and Morocco and Royal Air Maroc. As you know, Royal Air Maroc is the national carrier of Morocco, but it's also an African airline.
Sure.
And Africa has always been in the heart of our priority. Africa is our past, our present is our future. Our first international flight was Casablanca-Dakar, launched in 1957. Since that, we built a great African network covering all West Africa capitals. And in 2020, when we are speaking that crisis, it may be in such opportunity, we achieve an important thing, joining one word, the most prestigious alliance in the world. With this membership, we bring the world to Africa, adding more than 1,000 connections, and we bring Africa to one world. So we are very proud of being African airline, of being member of One World Alliance. Speaking about development, for me, Africa is a very resilient continent. It has been demonstrated through multiple healthy and security crises. And every crisis, Africa was able to rebound very quickly. The economy show a very good increasing trend, confirmed by air traffic figures. Africa presents wide opportunities in different sectors: tourism, construction, telecom, and the most important opportunity is the young population of Africa, becoming more and more educated, more digitalized, with more income and involving precision habits. So today, airline can benefit of this prosperous context to develop itself if states manage and succeed to lift in some constraints that we are facing today. And I can give you some examples. For us, from RAM perspective, the issue for the development is the restricted traffic rights in Africa. We are facing this problem. Another issue is the complicated operational environment, fuel supply. Some exclusive provider, for example, for the handling. So we have the biggest rates of fees and taxes in African airports, mainly in West Africa, with the highest in the world. We have also documentary control, visa. We have to digitalize all that to facilitate the travel for the population. We can also speak about the brand, Africa brand for the tourism. You know, today the traffic is mostly traffic for diaspora in the world. In Africa and Europe, for example, we are the first hub between Europe and Africa, but most travelers are the diaspora. We have to develop tourism by developing a strong brand. So today, for me, we can go further on the development if we work together to lift all that challenge.
Maybe a question for you, Rob. And Mrs. Cassini was saying that Royal Air Maroc is joining your alliance. What does it mean for you to have a new member like La Royal Air Maroc? And maybe second question, how do you see the future of air traffic in Africa, given what Mrs. Cassini just said?
Great. Well, I feel quite humbled being asked to answer the second question with such an esteemed audience and experts and CEOs of leading airlines in this region, but I will give you my perspective on it shortly. The easy part of the question is Royal Air Maroc, because they're a fabulous airline. It's an amazing country. I've had the privilege of coming here many times now. I'd actually visited Morocco long before Royal Air Maroc joined One World long before I worked in the aviation industry, so I've always had a fondness. But they bring, One World didn't have an African member, domicile, African member airline. We had a number of member airlines serving the African continent in multiple markets and a lot of frequencies into Africa. But we thought it was very, very important that we actually had an airline based here. And, you know, there were a lot of discussions we had. Obviously, we talked to various candidates. Where Royal Air Maroc stood out, I thought their values were very much aligned to what we were trying to achieve at One World, particularly in terms of quality of the product. There are other values, their commitment to sustainability, for example, which I know we're going to talk about a little bit later. But I felt sort of culturally, and I think they felt the same. There was a very good alignment with the One World membership base. And that's very important in terms of the chemistry of how the alliance actually works. Kind of more strategically, Casablanca, probably the leading business city. I should say it is the leading business city in Africa, so I'm actually in Casablanca. I'm pretty sure it is on most economic metrics, but an amazing place to come and do business. Obviously, as a leisure and tourist destination, it has an amazing product to offer as well. But the geographical advantage, particularly for flows from Europe into parts of Africa, was a big, big part of the attraction. And one of the big benefits of the alliance is actually the connectivity it creates, the origin destination points that adds access to a market that is very hard to build organically. And that's not to say that the airlines in Africa haven't done a good job building organically, they have, but there's an exponential benefit when you connect it up with a big global alliance. So they've been enormously important to us coming into this alliance for those key reasons. Again, I could talk a long time about this. We spent a lot of time with the leadership team at Royal Air Maroc talking about their fleet plans, their own network growth, and how we could align it to drive additional value, not just for Royal Air Maroc, but for our other member airlines. In terms of the broader aviation development platform, I think it's been incredibly well covered today in detail with a lot of great perspectives that I've heard on the various panel conversations. I think if I was to kind of look at it more at 30,000 feet rather than into the detail of it, first of all, we look at the contribution that aviation makes to the global economy. It's over 4%. As an economy in its own right, it was the size of the Netherlands economy pre-COVID. It would have been the 17th largest economy in the world in its own right for aviation. Here in the African continent, it's less than 3% of GDP. So right off the bat, you can see there's a disparity in that. I think the government policy setting is going to be crucial going forwards. I think I've heard a lot today about single market, which is a great initiative, and I think that's going to be very, very important in terms of intra-Africa development. But I think there has to be a much broader liberalisation approach to governments more generally here. Not just in terms of traffic rights, but some of the other elements that have already been mentioned. Visas are not necessarily very easy to get to many African countries for many nationalities. So I think there are some, what I would describe as relatively low-hanging fruit, things that are probably quite easy to do because it's more around policy, government policy. Now, it's never easy getting alignment of government policy, but it's easier than some of the more logistical and physical challenges we have. Obviously, Africa suffers from high fuel prices. It's another massive issue. Taxation is very high in the aviation sector relative to the other parts of the world. The disparity in income levels in the African continent versus the rest of the world make it more challenging to build an organic Africa origin market, where you've got statistics that I've seen for intra-African travel, somewhere around about 2.5 times a week's salary versus less than a quarter of a day in the West. I mean, it's an incredible disparity, almost 7 times for international travel. And that makes it more challenging. Now, part of that is the cost structure, but obviously a large part of it is the income distribution around the world. So there are a lot of natural headwinds that are going to be challenging to overcome, but I think on the government policy settings, there are things that can be done. What I really like today as well, particularly when I was listening to the safety sector, I can't remember which panelist made this comment, but it was an excellent comment. He said, look, frankly, I think it might have been Alan, actually, from KQ that made the comment. He's sitting in the front row there. I think, Alan, if I plagiarised you, I apologise. But I think what he said, that the actual airlines are doing a better job getting alignment on some of the key safety metrics and key safety protocols, and getting a lot more cohesion around helping one another get up to the same level than some of the CAAs are in the continent. And I thought that was a brilliant exhibition of leadership, what the airlines can do and say. Again, I could probably talk for a long time on generalities, but I want to give my fellow panelists a chance to do that.
Mr. Tassou, thanks, Rob. Mr. Tassou, Rob mentioned the challenges of demography, of income distribution in the context of Africa developing quickly, especially in air traffic. How do you, and in the context also of a more fragmented geopolitical world at the moment, the systemic rivalry between China and the US, what's happening in Europe and Ukraine, how do you see the air traffic in Africa developing, and what do you want to take in terms of
Okay. Africa is expected to develop faster than ever, and the air traffic or the air transport demand is expected to grow also. On the other hand, to stimulate socio-economic development of the continent, the air transport industry is expected to play its role in promoting air connectivity within Africa, trade, and political integration among African people, African countries. Unfortunately, the air transport industry is not yet developed, particularly the intra-Africa traffic. When we first see the connectivity between Africa and the rest of the world, we know that more than 80% of the traffic is served by non-African airlines. But the intra-Africa traffic is still underserved significantly, and this is a result of lack of strong, enough number of strong airlines within Africa. We need to work to develop the internal or the continental air transport capacity within Africa. As my colleague from Royal Air Morocco mentioned, there are several factors that hinder this development. The first one is the governments have not created enabling environment for the airlines to grow, expand, and become self-sufficient by themselves. Most airlines in Africa are owned by the government, the major ones. And they rely mainly on government financial support to do their operation. This is not the type of air transport service that Africa needs to have. Africa needs to have enough number of African airlines who can support themselves financially and continue growing, creating value to the continent and supporting African development. To bring this, number one, the governments have to create enabling environment by, for example, implementing open sky so that all airlines can fly everywhere, providing convenient connectivity at affordable fares. The tax system needs reform on the tax system on the airlines. And we should have good governance among African airlines, and we should provide them with the leadership they need. We need to avoid government interference. We hear in most airlines there's interference, which has to be avoided. As long as government interference is there, whether the airline is owned by the government or privately owned, the air transport industry will have a big problem, a big hindrance from being developed. This is an important factor to expedite the growth of the African air transport industry. The other one is the airlines themselves need to have a sound strategy in terms of network, in terms of fleet, in terms of human resource development, and so on. Some airlines have only 5 aircraft and 3 types of aircraft model. It doesn't work. For an airline to be successful, it has to control its cost. Cost control is a critical success factor for the success of an airline. And the airlines we have today have to focus on their cost control as well. If we do this, we will create a strong airline industry in Africa.
Maybe, so you mentioned synergies between airlines, and one question for you, Mr. Munetsi, in that context, do you think that Africa will know consolidation between airlines in the years to come? Is that something that is going to happen in the context of Europe, for example, Airline Association for the southern part of Africa?
Oh yeah, definitely. I have no doubt in my mind that the airlines will get their act together. But something is paining me right now as I sit here, and I want to share it with the audience. So I'm happy that I've got some airline CEOs here. I want to ask you guys a question. How many of you flew through other continents to get here? So you are responsible for connecting Africa. And you are letting us down because now you are flying to other continents to come back here. And then you are the same people who tell us that open skies is not happening because governments are not giving you an enabling environment. And how many of you actually applied for a visa to come here without asking for assistance from Maria and your team? How many of you got visas to get here? And how quickly did you get your visas? Without Maria. So I'm saying this because I want you to feel uncomfortable as much as I'm feeling unhappy, because that's where we are going as African airlines. We need to actually address these things boldly. We need to face them. Nobody else is going to come and help us. That's why I said a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. We are in the middle of that crisis. Now it's time for us to come up with solutions. And one of those solutions is for these African airlines. You and him need to talk. Not tomorrow, today.
This is a very useful roundtable.
And what do you need to talk about? You need to talk about how you are going to work together. Don't talk about how difficult it is to operate. No. Talk about how you are going to work together today to serve these customers. That's the only way we can solve this. Nobody is coming to help us, I can tell you this now. The alliances that we're talking about, Star Alliance, Sky Team,
One World.
These alliances were formed much later, after Africa had shown the world that you can work together. 41 years ago, an African alliance was put together. Afrique. 16 countries came together and formed an airline. Now, if that's not an example of an alliance, then what is an example?
I think consolidation is happening now. It's a very useful roundtable. Maybe we do have 5 minutes left or 6 minutes left. Maybe one very much important topic is decarbonization or sustainability in aviation. And I would like to maybe start with you again, Mr. Munetsi, regarding the initiative that, the operators, whoever, regarding what you do in terms of ground operation, sustainable aviation fuel, how you see the future for carbon-free aircraft to achieve the zero carbon emission goal by 2050. What is your...
That's another painful point for me. I mean, we are in the ICU in a hospital, we are dying, and you are asking us to donate blood? Decarbonization? Really? We don't have time for decarbonization. We have
It's
time to
2050.
survive.
We do have time to plan for it, at least.
We don't have time for that. We have time to survive. We need to survive now. Decarbonization, you are the guys who caused this problem for us. We only contribute 0.04%. And you want us to pay for it? I don't think Africa should be burdened with this story. It's not an African problem. Sort it out yourselves. Let us catch up with you. Honestly, I think we are wasting time talking about decarbonization in Africa.
Believe me, I've heard this speech before. I'm still willing to go for 2050 carbon neutral emission.
Yeah.
Madame Zidi.
Okay. For me, transportation industry in Africa is aligned with the sustainability vision. The most growing airlines has young fleets, and we are all aware that the efficiency is the key to maintain and to remain competitive. So the problem, the issue that we will be facing on the coming years is the infrastructure for SAF production in Africa. We face this problem today, and we will face it tomorrow. We need to have SAF available and affordable, because one of our concern is to have a big increase of fuel prices. So it is important that we work together with airline, with the ecosystem, to grant SAF production, because tomorrow it will be a big problem for us, and it starts today. In France, for example, there is a level, a percentage of SAF that we have to use. And in Africa, we don't fund any SAF production. This is, for me, a big issue for the development.
And this is a huge opportunity for Africa, because even Europe, that you like so much, they need a lot of low-carbon electricity, provided that you have a lot of sun and low-carbon electricity. You're going to be a big player in it.
But it's important to have balance between carbon emission and its offsets, because we are by far the continent that produce the lowest level of carbon emission. It is very important to keep this in mind.
Absolutely. From the perspective of Ethiopia, what's your view on that?
So whoever damages the environment, we have the responsibility to protect our planet. That is a very important point. I agree with the concern of my colleague on the right and also my sister that while we work in alignment with the international initiatives to reduce carbon emission, the offset issue will have to be discussed, because we have to be supported, as we are at the lowest level of air transport, and our contribution is very low. We want to grow faster than Europe or North America or Asia, but we have no choice. We have to follow ICAO targets set, and unfortunately, we African airlines are lagging behind on that initiative, but we are not too late. We will have to work with all stakeholders, and we have to urge our governments to support us in this initiative as well. They have a key role in availing SAF in the continent. So it's not a choice. It is our responsibility and obligation to work on that. We African airlines will have to work also together, and we have to cope up with the ICAO goals and IATA program.
Maybe, Rob, on that matter, how do we organize decarbonization at global level, given what was said today? And that's very fair. I've heard the speeches quite often. How do we share the burden in a fair way?
So I've got 30 seconds to answer that question. Right?
In order to do any...
it's like asking me what's the meaning of life, the universe, and everything. No, but seriously, I think I do understand the frustration when, in some parts of the world, people get on a moral high horse and lecture about sustainability. And I can see the temperature in the room on that particular topic very clearly. So, and I observed it earlier today, and I think it's a very fair point. I think whatever we sort of discuss and agree today, there is going to be a point of time in the future, and I think in the very near future, where sustainability and a meaningful achievement of the targets set, or a meaningful pathway to the targets to set, not just going to be policy settings or targets. They're going to be what we call in the US table stakes. If you don't, that's the price that you have to put on the table to get in the game. And I think it's going to be as simple as that. So we can argue about the inequity and the unfairness of it. And I do believe that there should be appropriate policy mechanisms set at a global level to take that into account. And it can be taken into account, but fundamentally, this is a real issue. The aviation industry is not going to escape it. I don't think it expects to escape it, but it goes beyond meeting targets. It goes beyond meeting ICAO targets. It goes back to some of the very basic things. Consumers are not going to purchase the brands and products we offer unless we have a commitment to this, particularly next generation consumers, current and next generation consumers. We're not going to be able to attract investment capital, which we desperately need to support our industry if we don't do this. Unfortunately, right now, in the near term, there's some very interesting developments, particularly around hydrogen, hybrid electricity, more around powering smaller aircraft, maybe up to 50 seaters. There was a great session today earlier on sustainability and decarbonisation. Some tremendous breakthrough technology being discussed and talked about, but they're big goals with a reasonable time horizon to see them fulfilled. I'm very confident that we'll find technology solutions. We're innovative people, we're humans. We'll find technology solutions to this, but it's a long and complex road to get there. Sustainable aviation fuel right now is one of the few levers that we can genuinely push. We have some interesting models. I think Africa, I hear mixed stories about whether it's the panacea in terms of green energy production, or actually it creates competition in terms of agricultural food production as well. And there's probably some truth in both of those. I don't know where it sits on the continuum, but it feels that there is probably an opportunity in this continent to get more deeply vested into SAF. And perhaps that's one of the trade-offs that could be made in terms of aviation concessions through the development phase. Right? That's just one of the things that's probably worth thinking about. And other places, and this is not an advertisement for One World, but we just did a huge SAF procurement jointly amongst One World members. We bought over 1 billion gallons of SAF in California from 2 producers. Very different deals. I can't disclose the content of them because they're commercially sensitive, but what's very interesting about it, and this has been mentioned earlier, I think Yannick might have made a couple of comments on this earlier around the Inflation Protection Act in the US and some of the federal level incentives, but at the state level, some of the work the states are doing is very, very good. So there are actually very good government-related operating models that are in use in certain parts of the world. The California one's particularly good because it drives down incentives at a very granular level. It is encouraging investment. We're likely to see that legislation repeated in a number of other states, particularly Democratic states in the US, certainly up and down the West Coast, potentially the New York state. So we're starting to see some meaningful lift in supply, but elsewhere it's very challenging. We're in an RFP at the moment in Europe, and it's very, very challenging. The volumes we're talking about are very, very small. So in terms of the production and infrastructure development, I think the number that was quoted earlier from a Bain study was well in excess of $1 trillion to get to 20%. That's huge. Well, that's more than the market cap of the whole airline industry, right? That's a huge amount of money. But I don't think there's an alternative. I think those investments are going to have to be made. And that's probably the last thing I'll say on that topic.
Thank you very much, Robert. Thank you very much to everyone. It's very frustrating. Next time we will ask for a 4 hours roundtable. But thank you, Max, for hosting us, and thank you very much for your participation today. Thank you.
Thank you.